Hi guys, and welcome back to day 29 of Inktober. So today's piece, I wanted to do one that was really strong and graphic and clean read and relatively simple in the subject matter itself. So I did want this one to look just really striking on its own, what it was. When I did start sketching this, it did end up being a little too long for the piece of watercolor paper that I had already had prepared and everything. And then I remembered that earlier piece that I had done where it was a very long piece, and I had mentioned I would probably do another long piece like that. Since I used half of that for her, I had another long piece left over, so it fit really nicely lengthwise for this one. But once I started looking at it through the light box and I was about to transfer the sketch over, I decided that I thought there was a little bit too much empty space between where the end of the tape began and where this object was in the middle of it. So I actually just ended up double taping it. So there's, I think it ended up being an inch of tape width around the sides, and then the top and the bottom I chose to do one tape width plus half of a tape width. So I think that ended up being 3/4 of an inch. And I really actually like doing more significant borders on the edges of pieces sometimes. I think it just looks really powerful and impactful, and I think that that worked really well for what this piece was. And I think it also balanced out the empty space around it, so now it's a little bit more tapered in and it makes a lot more sense with what's going on. But at this very beginning, what I'm actually using is a masking fluid, and this stuff is extremely useful. I love it, but I don't really pull it out and use it as much as I think I should, but it makes everything so much easier. But you do have to shake it up a lot, and I try to make sure that I shake this up every couple of days so it doesn't sit there and congeal too much, because I've had that happen where I didn't shake this up, and then when I went to use it, the entire bottle had just like dried up and turned into a ball of, I think it's latex actually. I think it's made out of latex, maybe. I could be wrong. But anyway, so yeah, you want to make sure that you're shaking it up and mixing it up every once in a while. But yeah, this stuff, if you're going to use it with a brush like I am, you want to be sure that it's a brush that you don't care about and you don't mind if it gets ruined. This brush that I'm using is actually dried solid. I've used it with Mod Podge and I've used it with this masking fluid before. So it's really far, far gone. And when I used it for those stuff, it was already really frayed and past the point of really a usable brush. So it's good to do that. But I've also just used like the back of a paintbrush or even a chopstick to spread this on, because you just have to like dab it on and it works really well and it spreads really nicely. And for this one, I didn't want to waste too much by covering the entire shape, because I knew when I go in with the ink wash, I'm not going to like go all over the internal area. So I just made sure to really thoroughly cover the edges so that I could go around it very easily. And I actually chose to do it very out of order for me for this one, because I decided to do the ink wash for the background first and then ink on top of it. And I think, well, typically I would go in with the ink first and then start doing all of the ink washes. But a lot of times the issue with this masking fluid and things like that is that there's always like these little dots or little lumps in the shape that I go too far out of bounds, so that there's this big space where it doesn't have the background, but it's not where the ink was. And a lot of times I have to either go in and dab in more of the ink wash or the paint or whatever I'm using to fill in that space, and it never blends in well anymore, or I have to go in and shoehorn the line work around it to cover that up. So this time I decided that I wanted to go in with the ink wash first, because then when I went in with the inking, I could right off the bat make sure that it was tailored around the shape that I did end up having, and that way I could fill any of those in a much more natural way rather than reacting to those shapes that I had to fill in. And for this background gradient, I wanted it to go from dark to light, but I also wanted it to have almost this decaying texture. So I wanted it to go dark to light, but I also wanted to have these little spots of lighter and darker areas. But I focused on the bottom so that these little like points that stood out were lighter, and then as it gradiated up, it reversed and it became those little dots were darker. And the way that you add darker is pretty obvious, but you just take in a brush and you just drop in a little bit of darker ink on top of the ink wash, and it'll spread out and it looks really beautiful. I love doing that with the ink washes and watching it kind of mingle together And for the bottom, where I wanted to do lighter areas, you just take water, straight water, and drop it in there, and it'll push the pigment away, and it'll give you these little cleaner, whiter areas. And this ink wash, I was really happy with how it looked. Even where it was really textured and blended in, it all had a really soft look to it, which was not what I was expecting. I was expecting it to look a little bit more where you could see some of the edges of where two different levels of pigment didn't quite blend together, but this one turned out really blended in and it looked really smooth, and I was really happy with that result. And this is the part that was super satisfying. I'm really glad that I did do it in the order of doing the ink wash in the background and then the line work, simply because the ability to like go in and very smoothly clean up those rough edges of the paint or the ink wash with this ink was just so satisfying. Cleaning up edges like that is one of my favorite things to do in art, being able to just make things really sharp and crisp and clean. And that was really fun going in with that and just, yeah, sharpening everything up. But when I was looking up reference for this and ideas, I was really heavily influenced by tattoos, specifically ones that had daggers and skulls. And there's just these really cool designs for tattoos that have daggers in them. And I wanted to incorporate some of the types of line work that were used in those designs into my piece. And some of the areas that I did that a little bit more so was where the dagger is stabbed in. The little areas of shadow right above and below where it comes through the skull, I did a darker shape, a diagonal shape where I filled that in with black, and then I did a couple more striating lines that kind of gave it this like gradiating effect with only black. And I think that was something that I saw come up in a lot of the designs, and I really love the effect that that had on the piece and how it gave it that shadow while still being really sharp and graphic. And the way that I chose to do the values for this one is that I did a darker medium tone for the background, and then I wanted really high contrast for the skull and the dagger so they would come forward and it would draw your eye immediately to it. So I had the skull mostly very, very white, the paper white. I let it shine through for most of it, and then the eye sockets and the nose hole, I had those as very dark, and I matched that same darkness within the handle of the dagger and some of the details within it as well. And then I also made sure that one plane of the blade was darker so that it would kind of give it that multi-dimensional look to it, like there's light hitting one side and not the other. And yeah, so I did want to make sure that most of the dark was focused on the dagger and most of the light was focused on the skull, but they both had a little bit of both within them. And this part was really fun because I knew that I was putting on a very dark ink wash, but I had just tested it on a scrap piece of paper. Most of these I've tested and then dried it out to make sure that it didn't end up too dark. So the area where I put the skull or the eye sockets and the nose, when I first put it down, it looks black, but then it dries to a very dark gray, but you can still see a transparency through it. So when I put that down and all that line work inside of it immediately disappeared, but then I was able to take in that heat gun and dry it out, and then you could see that emerge. That was a really fun moment to just watch as it became what I wanted it to. And I did want to make sure that the areas like that the line work was still visible and it still had those detailing to it, because that was something that I really wanted to make sure the line work was strong and it was infused in all the areas of this piece. Oh, but I did forget to mention, when I had the masking fluid and I put it down and then I did the ink wash, I was using the heat gun as I usually would to just dry it out so I can move on. There was a moment towards the end where it hit me and I'm like, I kind of remember that I'm not supposed to use the heat gun on this miskit, but why? I couldn't quite remember or place when I learned that I shouldn't be doing that or when I experienced that, but when I finished drying it off and I started peeling off that masking fluid, it was very faintly orange toned underneath it, and that's when I remembered that it does actually stain the paper when I heat gun it. It's not too bad when you put it on and you use it like normal. I haven't had any staining unless I've left it on for longer than it's supposed to be on, but when you use that heat gun on top of it, it just like, it sticks a little bit of orange there. But luckily that was just mostly a reminder, because I was gonna go in with a very light value around it, and then there's just going to be more more stuff going on, so it wouldn't be nearly as noticeable as it would be on just straight white paper, but it was a good reminder to not do that on other pieces that it might be more significant of a problem. But that is everything for today's Inktober. I had a lot of fun working on something that was more simple. I really just wanted something that would look really good on a wall and be just good wall art and sharp and clean and more symbolic and stylized. And I'd like to do more of that because it's just really relaxing to do something that is not really as specifically necessary to be correct like a face is. This one I could do a lot of experimenting. I could put brush strokes in weird areas because I just wanted to see how it looked. So I had a lot more relaxing of a time working on this one than some of my other ones. But yeah, as usual, he is available at my shop, the original, so you can check that out. And I might do a print of this one. I don't know. Let me know if any of you are interested in a print of this, and I might actually turn it into a print because I do like how this one turned out. But that is pretty much it for today's Inktober. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys tomorrow for the next one.